Our club has always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas. Here, we offer access to dynamic political, business, and public personalities.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Shazam Chu, and I'm the director of Canadian Club Toronto. Viewers, thank you for joining us today. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We are grateful for the opportunity to be able to come together to learn on this land. There has been a huge effort in the last decade to improve financial literacy in Canada, from government, nonprofits, academia, and industry, but still the needle hasn't moved. Today, in celebration of Financial Literacy Month, we're joined by a panel of experts to hear their ideas and solutions for driving behavioral change. Before we hear from our speakers, here's some information about how to participate with us. The click here to refresh stream button helps if you find that your internet is slow. The video quality may decrease, but the audio quality should remain strong. Once you click the questions tab, you can enter your questions in the window and they will be sent to the moderator. The help button located in the bottom right corner of the page is for technical support. Thanks to the generous sponsorship of the Canadian Bankers Association, Home Equity, Bank, and LifeWorks, today's conversation is free of charge. We are grateful for your support of today's discussion. After today's panel, Mathieu Leprèche, Director of Media Strategy for the Canadian Bankers Association, will join us to thank the panelists. The Canadian Club is a nonprofit, and we have been gathering people together for 125 years. It is because of our sponsors, partners, and members that we are able to do so. Thank you for your continued support. Now to introduce today's panelists. Elizabeth Mulholland is the Chief Executive Officer of Prosper Canada. Idan Shlesinger is the President of Retirement and Financial Solutions and Executive Vice President at LifeWorks. And Dr. Supriya Syal, Deputy Commissioner for the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. Today's conversation will be moderated by Bruce Sellery, CBC Money columnist, CEO of Credit Canada, and honored past president of the Canadian Club. If you have a drink nearby, I'll ask you to join me in a toast to our country, to Canada.
To Canada.
Canada.
Bruce, I'll turn the podium over to you.
Thank you so much. Financial Literacy Month. It's basically Christmas, Halloween, Easter, Diwali, like everything rolled into one for those of us who've been focused on this for a very, very long time. And there are two elements to it, right? There's the consumer element. So at Credit Canada, we are focused on the consumer. Our theme is money magic. We've got magicians. There's magic tricks. Oh, there's a coin. There's a bigger coin. So we're playful and trying to engage the consumer in new and interesting and relevant ways to help them get a better handle on their money. At the same time, there is a conversation to be had with stakeholders, with the many, many members of this broad ecosystem that will help consumers get a better handle on their money. And if there is a spectrum of sort of the audience that we expect is tuned in today for this event at the Canadian Club, there are more of you who we would say are influencers or leaders in the ecosystem, in the stakeholder group. So that is really going to be the focus of our conversation. And I promise you that we will move beyond the basic mom and apple pie stuff that we sometimes talk about when it comes to financial literacy. One of my favorites is, let's teach financial literacy in schools. Yes, of course, we should do that. And what else? And what else? And what else? And we are so set up to have a really forward-looking conversation with the panelists that we have assembled today. We also included the word digital in our topic, and we included that for a number of reasons. First, there is so much going on. There is so much going on in the public sector and in the private sector when it comes to digital, and it is a big part of the problem and the solution. So we're going to talk about both those two things as it relates to digital. A welcome to our panelists, and Supriya, I want to start with you. This phrase, financial literacy, it's part of what the FCAC does. And yet, I think all of our panelists know that if we could have a different phrase to represent the work that we are all doing, it might not be financial literacy. If you could snap your fingers and rebrand this work, what would you call it?
I wouldn't call it anything different.
You'd still call it financial literacy. Okay, tell me why.
I would call it financial literacy and define it slightly differently, because I think there's a fair bit of confusion on what does actually constitute financial literacy. So for the purposes of our national strategy, we actually do define it so that we can clear up the air, if you will. We say that financial literacy includes not only the skills and capacity to make informed financial decisions, which is the prevalent rhetoric, but also, this is the crucial part, actions or behaviors that lead to positive financial outcomes. So importantly, this means that a financial literacy initiative is only successful if it leads consumers to achieve outcomes that are appropriate for their needs. So financial literacy, if you will, education, is a means to an end, the end being the outcomes. We have to measure if we're actually achieving those outcomes to decide whether or not an initiative or any sort of financial literacy approach was successful.
Okay, Idan, your take. If you could rebrand, what would you do?
I think it's a great question, Bruce, and I like how you phrased that, Supriya, as well. When we think about it, we tend to use the term financial well-being, but I'd go a little bit further because we put together a few things. We put together literacy, but also actions, as Supriya said, and confidence is the third piece, which we find is really key to helping people. And the phrase that I like when you put that together is really that we're focusing on people's relationship with money and looking to improve that overall relationship rather than just one of those metrics.
Liz, for you.
I appreciate Supriya's valiant attempt to stretch the term financial literacy. But I think I'm with Idan. I would go with financial well-being because I think it represents the full spectrum of financial outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And also I worry that financial literacy puts too much emphasis on the individual when we know that many of the things that need to shift are not just individual behavior, but the conditions and the ecosystem that needs to be there to enable people to achieve financial well-being.
Liz, I want to begin with this hot off the presses research that you have done in collaboration with a number of other players that paint a clear and troubling picture of what it's like to be a household with a lower income in this country. Tell us about some of the highlights of that research.
Sure. It was an incredibly rich study conducted by Seymour Management Consulting, Inc. But I'm going to focus on 5 key takeaways that I think are the most important for our discussion today. So first is the number of lower income households grew unbelievably from 2018 to 2021 in Canada. And lower income, we mean any household with an income under 25,000 and a multi-person household with an income under 50. So what we saw is when we surveyed people in June 2021, 26% of Canadian households fell into this bucket, which was a shocking number. And that represents 6.7 million households in total, and that's up from 4.6 million in 2018. So a huge growth.
And
Secondly,
I just want to, I can't believe that as a headline. I read the executive summary in advance of this. Tell me why. That is like a jaw dropper increase.
Well, I think a lot of people saw their incomes go down during the pandemic. And even though government relief was quick to flow, for some people, they weren't eligible for the relief. If you were lower income and you only lost part of your hours, you didn't get any relief, so your income didn't go up if you didn't qualify. But also there are a lot of middle income families that relief was not enough to cover their fixed expenses. So people slid, And I think probably since June, you're going to see that number may have changed and improved. A lot has happened since June. Lots of the economy has opened up. So I don't think it's a total doom and gloom story, but it was a pretty shocking impact and not completely unpredictable with the kind of scale of closing down in the economy that we saw. But I think what we're more worried about is the fact that more households in that lower income bracket are struggling financially compared to in June 2020. So we're seeing sort of this kind of continual slide of more households are doing worse in that group, despite all the government assistance and the credit holidays, from banks and credit card companies. There are a lot of measures taken to help people, but nonetheless, we're seeing more people in that lower income bracket are struggling financially. 65% of them are really extremely financially vulnerable or financially vulnerable. And 41% are telling us their debt feels unmanageable, and 40% are unable to meet their essential expenses. And we're talking basic food, shelter, utilities. So thirdly, those households have been working incredibly hard to bridge through financially and to try and stabilize. So we've seen them, 71% reduce their non-essential expenses. People improved their financial literacy, found new ways to earn money, created budgets. A third of them sold or pawned things to get by, and 20% of them actually moved to lower their accommodation costs. That's a big disruption in your life in a pandemic to actually move. But 1 in 5 actually picked up stakes to try and get their costs down. So they're doing the right things. And then some of them have actually had to do some of the things out of necessity that are going to undermine their financial health. And that's really worrying. So 43% told us they increased borrowing just to meet their everyday expenses. So food, utilities, et cetera. And a bunch of them, over a third, had to defer some kind of debt payment. And we know that a lot of those deferrals have ended now, but we know in the lower income category and renters, there more of them are still in arrears than I just read a Bank of Canada report last night. That wasn't in our study. And despite all those efforts, we've heard a lot about the financial gains that Canadians overall made during the pandemic, record levels of savings, debt being paid down. But when we look at this income group, we're not seeing that picture. So just under 2/3 of Canadians with high incomes over 150,000 told us actually their financial situation improved during the pandemic. And 40% of Canadians overall told us that. But when you look at lower income people, only 1 in 4 had that experience. The rest of them, same or worse. And finally, despite all this, people are having trouble finding the help they need. So we saw a lot of lower income people saying they lack the social capital that they could turn to, friends, family, contacts that could help them bridge through financially. We also saw that 63% of them don't trust their primary financial institution enough to open up about their financial problems and stresses and to seek help there. So, and they also, some of them had, 14% had trouble finding nonprofit help and assistance. So
it's not a pretty picture. It is not a pretty picture. I want to include Idan here because LifeWorks comes at this question with research of its own. You field the Financial Wellbeing Index. What would be a couple of the highlights for you, Idan, in this category?
Yeah, it's actually quite consistent with a lot of what Elizabeth is referring to. I'd say the key message from our latest survey is that even when you look at employed Canadians, and that is our focus, tends to be on employed Canadians, there's a lot more financial stress and strain than you might think. And it's far more widespread than people realize. As we measure how folks are doing, we find there's 3 clear groups in the population, and each roughly represents a third of workers. There's a third who's doing really well. They were doing well before the pandemic, and they're doing as well or better now. They feel confident, they've got access to savings, they're kind of focused on investing and retirement planning, and they're being really well served by the financial services industry and by what most employers are doing. Then you have a middle group. They're doing okay. They kept their jobs and their income. They've seen some improvement actually in savings. They're spending a little bit less. They've actually been making a really good effort to improve the situation. And we see these people are really focused on budgeting, on planning, on trying to make good decisions. They are still feeling worried and uncertain. I think we all feel a little bit of that these days, unsure what the future holds. But I'd say this group is showing positive signs and actually drives most of the overall improvement that we see across the board. I'd say they really need to be encouraged. They need to be given information and tools. And we believe employers can play a really key role here. And,
Supriya, sorry, Idan, you can make that last point. Sorry,
I'll just quickly. So there is a bottom group. It does represent a full third of the working population. And I think every employer has a good chunk of them. It skews a little younger, a little bit more female. And these people are really struggling. So they're spending their entire paycheck every month. They don't have any emergency savings. They're trying to keep up with their bills. And I'd say for this group, a lot of what employers are doing, things like retirement savings and literacy, is actually falling flat because this group actually needs to focus on the short term and have very personalized help. And that's a little bit lacking.
Supriya, what would you add from the perspective of the FCAC to paint the picture of the reality today?
Yeah, so there's no doubt that the pandemic has had unprecedented effect. We've been fielding a survey for over a year now, a monthly nationally representative survey, and I would say our data largely points to the same trends that Liz and Idan have been speaking to. But I'd like to make another point here, and I will make that point using example of sugarcane farmers. So sugarcane farmers harvest their crop annually, meaning that all of their income for a year comes at one point in the year. So just before they harvest, they are at their poorest because they have spent all the money they made the previous year. Just after they harvest, they're at their richest because now they've made all the money they have for the next year. If you give sugarcane farmers a series of cognitive tests just before the harvest, so when they're at their poorest, and just after the harvest, when they're at their richest, you see that there is a significant difference. They perform much worse when they are feeling poorer than when they are feeling richer. This has been replicated, validated in various other scenarios, various other contexts, various other people. The point is that this phenomena is called scarcity of resources. Scarcity of resources, such as money, impedes cognitive function. It imposes a cognitive tax on people, presumably because they are spending too much time, too much mental energy worrying about immediate cash flow and don't have the bandwidth to think about long-term needs. Good financial decisions need us to plan for long-term needs, think outside of those immediate needs. So the perspective I'm trying to bring is as we recover from the economic fallouts of the pandemic in the coming years, we need to remember that many people are in a resource poor environment, are feeling the scarcity of resources and are facing an uncertain future, much more so than they were before the pandemic. To counter the burden of this cognitive tax that people are feeling, we need to pay extra attention to make sure that our programs are not just good, but that they are good enough to make it actively easier, cognitively easier, for people to make the decisions that will lead them to good financial outcomes.
It is abundantly clear, Supriya, that you are not a bureaucrat, you are not a banker, you bring an entirely new and refreshing perspective as a scientist, as a behavior scientist. I want you to describe how you have brought that lens to this renewed national financial literacy strategy. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, you need to Google it right now. It's one page. It's very simple. A 10-year-old could understand it. And it really lives and breathes the insight that you spoke about with that example about the sugarcane farmers. Tell me about that lens.
So I'll say behavioral science or behavioral science approach, or really any evidence-based research approach, frankly, is embedded throughout the national strategy and indeed in the work of most of my team. So we use it to diagnose the problem, we use it to design the solution, we use it to evaluate whether or not the solution is useful. In the context of the strategy, for instance, one of the core principles is that people don't make decisions in a vacuum. If we want to drive behavioral change, we need to keep the environment or the context in which people are making decisions in mind. The context of a decision matters as much as the content of that decision. And it is from this understanding of human behavior that we arrive in the strategy at barriers and catalysts in the ecosystem, or how the environment around the consumer is impacting the decisions they are able to make, and why we need to remove the barriers and why we need to add the catalysts. In terms of designing the solution, many of the ways we implement the strategy obviously includes behavioral science, but also using behavioral design to simplify choices is a key priority. And then the last piece I'll say, I see you're eager, Bruce, but I'll quickly just say that the evaluation is fully based in a sort of behavioral science or just an outcomes-based approach. And that's sort of the point I was trying to make with my financial literacy stretch, which I will actually say, a rose by any other name is still a rose. So I don't know that it does anything for us.
A reminder to everyone that we will take your questions throughout our time together, so please feel free to ask them. I do want to bring in the notion of digital, and before we get to solutions, I want to highlight, have us as a group highlight some of the challenges that digital represents, because there's been some unintended consequences of having, you know, a smartphone accessible to many, but not all, but many Canadians in a way that that it wasn't before. Liz, I'm going to come to you, but I'll say from our standpoint at Credit Canada, one of the challenges is that social media has put the advertising of some of the bad actors, the questionable players, front and center. And a consumer has a very, very difficult time discerning what is an ad from an accredited nonprofit credit counselor, an ad from a licensed insolvency trustee, and then all these other players who seem to be in that business. So advertising on social has been a problem. Liz, what would you say are some of the challenges that digital presents?
Yeah. So that's a great one, Bruce, that you started with, which is trust. Who do people trust? Knowing who to trust. In the populations that we work with, lower income, social trust is quite low in general. But we found the most effective way to reach people is through an intermediary that they do trust. So it might be a trusted community organization, a church, community group, whatever it is, or their municipal government, somebody that they already have a relationship with, that they trust and have confidence in. So I would say, and we know that people tend to want to access these digital things through partners in our work and some of the work that we've seen in like FinTech Accelerator, Innovate Financial Health, is that people like to access these apps and things through their financial institution because they trust them, that it's going to be reputable and they won't steal their money. Or they'd like to be introduced through a community financial helper who can say, this app is a good app. It will help you to do this. And they can explain clearly what it is and what it does for them. People are using all sorts of apps, notwithstanding, but I think that's it. But we also saw a huge issue is just the cost of internet access for low-income people. And during the pandemic, it was heartbreaking to see how many people could not access information or services that they needed because they do not, low-income people tend not to have a computer in the home. They may have a smartphone, but they're very limited in the amount of data they can purchase. Those plans are expensive. They tend to rely heavily on public internet access sites like public libraries. So you would see people huddled in the cold outside of a closed public library because that was their only access to the internet. So, and then there are issues in the north with access just because broadband is not available, or in rural, it's too slow. So,
Idan, for you, what are the challenges that digital presents?
I think digital is really a modality. It's a tool, it's an environment. So there's no question that when we look at where people get their financial information, where they get their advice, there's people who are getting some, maybe most of their advice from places like social media, and that's scary. that leads you to all sorts of strange places, all sorts of problematic places. And I think we've got to be really careful there. But it's also a great opportunity, because the big challenge in the financial space is that you do need to engage with the individual. You need their individual circumstances. You need to really tailor solutions to them. And digital gives you the opportunity to do that. And the group that I'd actually add to the list of trusted intermediaries that people should be looking to are their employers. You really find that people do have a trusting relationship with their employers, and it gives employers a really great opportunity to leverage that to help their people in a way that they probably couldn't have done in the old world through paper or through group seminars. So there's a lot that can be achieved there. There's a lot of an advantage, but you got to watch out for some of the stuff that got picked up as well.
Supriya, one of the major technological advances that people underappreciate are scraping apps, right? Like, you can connect your accounts in ways that are almost unimaginable. One day we may be in a world of open banking in which that's, monitored and sorted out, and there's all the privacy and security that you could ever imagine, but that's not the case today. What's your take on that as a particular thing that consumers seem quite willing to click OK on?
Yeah, so there is a paucity of trustworthy and affordable financial advice. And in the absence of that, people don't know what is trustworthy and what is not trustworthy. And this is why, enhancing access to such advice is a significant priority of this strategy. The reason it is, though, and I think that spans whether it's digital or not digital, or, whatever way the advice is delivered, is that, we need to sort of just baseline acknowledge two things. One, it is not reasonable of us to expect people to be experts at everything. Like, obviously, we should be making advice available to people, particularly people who need it the most, such as low-income Canadians, who also tend to be the people who are least aware of where to go, as we've been talking about. And secondly, no matter how well we educate people, they are bombarded with millions of messages every single day. Financial decisions are but one subset of thousands of other types of decisions you make on a daily basis. So for us to say, well, people ought to be able to sift through all of this to figure out which one is the right one is simply not reasonable. So it is up to us in the ecosystem to make sure that we are creating pathways for people. And those pathways can take many forms. Those could be, digital apps. Those could be in-person interactions or online interactions with advisors or with robot advisors, whatever it may be. But it is up to us to make sure that people have access to both trustworthy and affordable financial advice.
You referenced digital both directly and indirectly in the National Financial Literacy Strategy. One place in particular, support increased digital access and digital literacy. What does that look like? What do you hope to see?
Well, I mean, the issue of digital access and digital literacy is obviously bigger than FCAC or any one actor. This needs to be an ecosystem approach with, multiple stakeholders, both within the government and outside the government. But the fact of the matter is that the financial sector is moving online at a alarmingly quick rate, but also lots of good comes from that. Speak to that later. So any financial literacy strategy for this time needs to contemplate two things. A, we need to support people's ability to be online, and B, second, we need to support people's ability to effectively and securely navigate that online world. One suggestion we make in the financial literacy strategy is that we start embedding digital literacy in financial literacy initiatives across the country. That could be one way to approach it. But of course, the biggest sort of foundation underlying the strategy is that we don't actually know all the solutions. But what we are suggesting is that we all collectively test different things and then share the data to say this works. And also equally important, this does not work. So let's not do it to enhance, in this case, digital literacy, digital access. But of course, there's a number of priorities.
Idan, I want to ask you about this specific example that you are more than testing. You're rolling it out. It is a digital app. It's called My Finances. Tell us what the objective is of this project and what you have learned so far.
Absolutely, Bruce. Really what we're doing is we're helping employers to support their people who are struggling to improve their knowledge, their confidence, their behavior, address the risks. My Finances is a digital, mobile, desktop and mobile experience. It connects with other things that the employer is already doing, with other products and other programs that they already have. And it's really designed to bring people in quickly and engage them in an interactive experience that builds their confidence and helps them to develop personalized learning and action plans that improve their situation. Specifically when it comes to literacy, we're using something called microlearning, which what you're doing is you're delivering these little nuggets of information in a very interactive way and right when they're most relevant. And what we found is that approach improves retention of people by as much as 80% of the traditional methods. And then the other thing that we're doing is we're using this product to deliver really clear data to the employers about the trends and the needs within their population, and we can kind of break it down into different groups so that they can really tailor what they're doing across their well-being programs to meet those specific needs. And so we've started rolling this out, as you said, to our clients and getting a fantastic response. It's really meeting the needs for organizations who are focused on their employees' overall well-being, but are missing that core financial hub that really targets individuals very specifically and helps them to leverage what the employer is already doing or other services that we can bring to bear.
I want to weave in a question that one of our attendees has asked, Idan, which is what responsibilities do employers have beyond what's going on for government and nonprofit? I mean, I can see from an employee engagement standpoint why My Finances would make sense, but do they have a responsibility? Is it a part of the social contract in your view?
I guess I would say it's probably part of the overall relationship that the employer has with an employee. I think we've seen over the years, employers have been more focused on their employees in multiple ways. Mental health has become a really important topic. And I think that financial health, financial well-being falls into that same space. There are selfish reasons why employers should do it. We do know that people who struggle from a financial wellness standpoint struggle with productivity. We know that they're more likely to leave their employer for actually a pretty small increase in pay. So we know there's a lot of those aspects which really serve the employer's bottom line and really make a lot of sense. But I do think it does come down also just to that overall relationship and say, if you're looking for a trusting, long-term committed relationship with your employees, you need to look at the entire person. And I think that includes mental and physical, but also financial health.
Liz, I want to talk about Trove. So Trove is something that Prosper Canada has been working on. It is super easy to navigate and really seems to speak to folks who have lower incomes in this country. Tell us a bit about it.
Sure. So yourtrove.org is an online site, bilingual, that's designed for people with lower incomes who want to take independent action to improve their financial health. And it's really set up to help them take charge of their finances, save more, and reduce debt. And what it is a set of tools and resources that are super easy to use, really plain language, lots of toolkits and worksheets, very practical. So, if you're looking for a way to quickly improve your financial health and your lower income, you can simply visit yourtrove.org and you can start to learn and take action immediately in very simple ways that work for just about anybody. So, and even if you're not low income, it might be helpful too if you're looking to pull up your socks financially. So it also connects people to a few online financial tools. So we have the Financial Relief Navigator, where people can access information about pandemic income relief that's available to them and debt and expense relief. There's a My Money in Canada financial information education tool, and for people with disabilities, an RDSP calculator, so they can explore different saving options.
Supriya, the FCAC has been involved in a pilot program, the Refund to Savings program, which sounds like a fantastic riff on Thaler and Save More Tomorrow. Tell us about the pilot and what they've learned so far.
It is a riff on Taylor and his Save More Tomorrow. So it's basically a series of behavioral insights that we embed into the tax filing process to get people to deposit or try to encourage people to deposit their tax refund into a savings account as opposed to spending it. We've run it for 2 years now, and what we're finding, our data show that between 6 to 9% of people commit to saving. Sounds like a small number, but translates into millions and millions of dollars. And we are also finding that people who receive the intervention, it's an experiment, so we have an intervention condition and a control condition. So people who receive the intervention are more likely to deposit their refund into a savings account as opposed to a checking account. People in control condition don't show this. There's also a couple of other findings which are interesting, such as people who have a TFSA are twice as likely to deposit into a savings account as opposed to not. And then that people who have a slightly larger tax refund, so if you have a refund of $1,000 or more, also significantly more likely to deposit to savings and check.
So there are so many things out there. There are digital interventions and apps that will be viewed in the future as having been successful. And there are those who will be viewed as having been failures. But for every failure, I think we can say that they moved us forward because they taught us things. So the two that I'm familiar with, one is called Every. It was software as a service. It was trying to use behavioral economics to help people do things differently. And Carrot Rewards, which was an app that I was associated with on the financial literacy front. FCAC did a bunch of testing on that front. Supriya, what would you say about what we learned from the things we tried that didn't work out in the way that we had hoped?
Things we tried that didn't work out in the way that we had hoped. Well, I would say two sets of things. One, an experiment, any kind of experiment is basically a risk mitigation strategy. We're trying to say, let's try something on a small scale, make sure it actually works to do the thing that we're trying to get it to do. If it does, let's scale it. If it doesn't, let's stop it or let's change it. So it is very, very, very important to try a number of things and know that some of them will in fact fail, because without trying those numbers of things, you don't actually arrive at the one that is going to work. So from my perspective, I think it's very important. That is very important. Specifically, what we've learned is that tailoring content to people's context is what works best. So, and this is in behavioral interventions, but this is also a general learning. So, we talk about just-in-time financial knowledge or financial information in the context of our strategy, and it makes a lot of intuitive sense, right? Like if you want to teach me about a mortgage, do it when I'm thinking about buying a house, not 5 years before I'm buying a house. Like I'm most likely to pay attention to that which is relevant to me, and I'm most likely to be motivated to learn things that are relevant to me. Broader studies, I'll just say one other point. So there's a large-scale examination of about 200 different financial literacy interventions, and it essentially shows that there is, in the context of financial knowledge, as all forms of knowledge, a decay function. So even the best types of interventions will have an impact for 20 months at the most. Many have an impact for much lesser amount of time. So that tells us two things. One, that we should be teaching just-in-time information, which is relevant to people at the time at which they're making decisions. It also tells us that, if you look at the content of what we are teaching people, so the content of financial education, it is probably less important to teach people about compound interest and more important to teach people how to make a plan, how to take a risk, how to be proactive when thinking about their finances or life in general. So the skills that we are teaching people through financial literacy education or interventions, behavioral, science-based or otherwise, likely need to be broader than the very, very specific content that some financial literacy education tends to focus on.
Idan, I want to come to you on my next question. In that, LifeWorks has been in the EAP business for a very, very long time. I know it's not the only thing you do, but it's one thing that you have done for a long period of time that provides you with a particular insight into the intersection of all these things. Because when someone calls one of your counselors, they could have 14 things that they need to talk about that are driving anxiety and depression or whatever. Tell us about Ability CBT and the intersection of your work on some of these other root causes and how they connect to financial well-being.
It's a great question, Bruce. And it really, I think, speaks to the fact that well-being is one big, messy, complicated thing where everything is wrapped up in everything else. We tend to think about mental health, physical health, social health, and financial health, and the fact that they do all link together very, very closely. And so we do have a number of different services. As you mentioned EAP, you mentioned Ability CBT. These are different approaches to help people who are having challenges and helping them address them in different ways and different approaches. Different mixes of modalities, which becomes really, really important. Some people want to speak to somebody on the phone. Some people prefer to be dealing with a computer. Maybe it's an online chat, maybe it's texting, but there's different ways of doing it. And I think we really need to bring all these approaches to bear to help the person where they are. One of the biggest challenges, just speaking to some of the comments Supriya made, one of the biggest challenges that we really find is that people either don't know where to go to get information or to get help, or they're embarrassed to, or they're afraid to go and actually seek out this information. And so by having different approaches, different modalities, ones that speak to people who are in a different mindset, who are in a different life stage, different comfort with technology, we're really able to address these challenges in a multitude of different ways. Ultimately, it's all about helping the person get better, but you need to be able to get there from different directions.
Liz, I want to ask you about pensions, because this is not a country in which most people have a defined benefit pension plan. And for lower income Canadians, they've got so many systemic barriers that they're trying to navigate and work towards. What are you seeing on the pension front that can make a difference for the population that isn't earning 80, 90, 100, $3 million a year?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, one of the biggest hurdles is when you get down towards the lower end of the wage scale is people are more and more precariously employed. So they're not strongly attached to one employer. Often they're in casual, part-time, contingent contract. And this extends up the income scale too. There are plenty of high-end consultants who are contract workers too, but the financial impact is much worse when you're low income because you can't control that flow of money. And when you don't know how much money is coming in or when, you cannot automate your savings, so you don't save. And typically in low wage environments, employers aren't offering extensive employee benefits like retirement savings plans. So I think what is most interesting are these new entrants, and I'll cite the example of Common Good, something that I volunteered on, but it's developed by Commonwealth, a social purpose business. It's aimed at building a really great, fully portable retirement saving plan that's more affordable than the retail savings offerings on the market for workers in the nonprofit sector, 47% of whom are contract workers and contingent. So that was launched in January, and there's lots of employers signing up. Encourage people to look at it, but we need those for other sectors as well, other low wage sectors. And I know there's another, SEIU is partnered with Commonwealth to do one for personal care workers. There are many of their members work in that industry, in that sector. It's very low wage, a lot of casual work. So we need a lot more of those solutions. And it would be great if government could be a partner in helping to seed some of that innovation. It took us 3 years to raise the money just to get this off the ground. It was a bootstrap exercise. And if we had spent less time on raising the money and more time on getting the thing out the door and rolling it out, a lot more people could have a lot more savings by now. So I think we need to speed up this innovation focus in this area and really get behind these startups. And there's lots of great ideas out there, but we need to put some serious juice behind them.
Some serious juice behind it. I love that phrase. Supriya, one of the other elements of the financial literacy strategy seems so intuitive, and it is communicate in ways in which people understand, in which people can understand what you're saying. I want you to answer this question in two ways. First is the politically correct way, and the second is in the way that you actually really would answer the question if it was, you know, just you and I quietly and not on an event attended by a couple of hundred people. Do you think industry has an interest in communicating to people in ways that they can understand? Because when I read the terms and conditions and the contracts and the I think they have no interest in making it possible for us to understand.
So you'll find that both my responses are what should I say, encouragingly or saddeningly close, depending on how far you wanted me to go. But I think industry does have an interest, and that is, so right now, you know, the way these documents are written, they are following regulation, or so we've been very prescriptive in our approaches. We've said write in plain language, write in a font size, write in not using jargon, and that is being followed. What something like this priority communicates with ways people understand does is just sort of turn the whole thing on its head, and it says, look, we actually need to measure the outcome. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you write in font size X. It doesn't matter if you do an interpretive dance. The point is the person at the end needs to understand what it is that we're talking about. And so on the one hand, to answer your question, I think industry does have a interest in that, because the greater people's understanding of a given product, the greater the likelihood that they get the right product and that negative outcomes don't happen. They don't go back, they don't complain. There's all the good that comes from that. On the other hand, the regulator also has a role in this, and we've stated that in our strategy as well. You know, enhancing consumer protections as the industry evolves over time. Digitization being a great example. So too must the regulator, so that we can continue to effectively protect people in the ways that they need protection.
We've talked about the strategy in multiple ways, and I just want to give you one last opportunity to choose your very, 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 very favorite piece of the strategy that we have not talked about. As I said, I describe it as something a 10-year-old could understand. It's genius in its simplicity. What's one other element that we haven't talked about that you feel that this audience should know?
We talked about it, but very fleetingly. So I want to reinforce the point, which is it is best to test.
That's good. Did you come up with that yourself? Is that a cliche that all behavioral scientists have? Do you have it on a t-shirt? Is it on a mug?
Probably, it's on the back. You know, what to test, as for what to test, it does not matter if the idea comes from behavioral science or it comes from your shower. The thing is, data is the great democratizer, because data tells us what people will actually do, what will actually work, and it is betting on those actions rather than the rhetoric that will help us make change. That counts.
Best to test. I love it. That's actually in advance the answer to a question we just received about how industry can measure the impact of their emerging programs. Idan, let me just throw that to you briefly. How do you measure this stuff? I mean, you operate at a very high level of sophistication. Metrics are important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're important to employers. They're important to everybody, really, to understand, are we actually achieving what we're looking to achieve? We really, again, want to look at that overall impact on the individual. So when we start working with an employer, we start off by looking at what is happening across the population. How are they tracking in terms of retirement? How they're tracking in terms of resiliency savings? How they're tracking in terms of their confidence and their, mentioned before, their relationship with money. And then we do need to keep monitoring that over time. We need to see that we're actually producing the change that we're looking to produce. And we need to innovate and evolve as we go through that process to see what's working here, what isn't working here. Best to test is a great phrase. I think we can probably borrow that a little bit. But I think it does speak to that exact notion of exploring a new space and experimenting and seeing how we can get to a better and better place.
We've just got 5 minutes left, and I want to save that time for what I would call a call to action. So to each of you three, I'm going to ask you what you want us to do. So we are engaged people. We are spending time during our day to hang out and engage in such a critical conversation. So Liz, first to you, what do you want people to actually do when they log off this event and return to their lives?
Well, they can make a donation to Prosper Canada, but I don't think that's the most important thing. I think my call to action is really aimed to our partners in the federal government. I think the national strategy is fantastic in identifying and calling out those gaps in the ecosystem and those pieces, those barriers that need to be addressed. But when you're dealing with really structural things like that involve solutions involve all sectors working together. I think somebody needs to set the table, call the players together and say, let's now work collectively on how we're going to solve this. Because these aren't simple things to solve. You know, like it's not, let's have a one-day, half-day session and everybody go home. It's like, let's set a working group. Let's have all the necessary players at the table and let's chew on this and start making incremental progress. And keep working on it till the job is done. So I hope FCAC will set the table for the conversation around access to financial help and advice. And I hope that, I can't remember what we call our industry department anymore. It has a new fancy name, but I think they have a role to set the table and bring the partners together from all sectors to say, how are we going to deal with this digital barrier and how we actually get people connected.
Thank you, Liz. Idan, what's your call to action? What should we be doing?
Well, I'd say speaking to employers, and the good news is there's a lot of employers who are on these calls, which is fantastic. I'd really encourage you to take ownership and to take action to help your people. You have people who are struggling, and they aren't necessarily the ones who you think they are. They need help, and they often don't know where to get it. They don't know how to get it. You have a trusted position where you really do have the opportunity to take that action and to do some good. And the best thing about it is that it doesn't necessarily mean spend more money. It means be more purposeful, be more focused on how you're spending the money you already are to help more people, different stages, different positions, and help them really achieve what they're looking to achieve and what you're looking to achieve for them. If you could just be more targeted and more effective in doing it.
Supriya, what would you say? We're all listening. I know a lot of this must feel like it falls on your shoulders, but you get to make requests too.
You know, there's a reason we chose financial resilience as the outcome of the strategy. And there are many reasons, but one of them I'll say is the one thing we've learned through the pandemic is that our financial sector is very resilient. Our financial consumers are not so much. In order to build that resilience, we need to understand how people make decisions, use that understanding to help them make the right decisions. We need to design a financial literacy ecosystem that helps people at the right time and in the right place. So what my call to action would be is look at the strategy. We have tried to set out suggestions for what different ecosystem stakeholders can do. We are very, very motivated to actually enact, to achieve the outcomes of the strategy if there is any way that we can help. We are absolutely there. Talk to us, but it's always best to test.
It's always best to test, 100%. Supriya, thank you so much. Supriya from the FCAC, Liz Mulholland from Prosper Canada, and Idan Shlesinger from LifeWorks. Thank you for joining us as panelists for this event. So much great work, so much insight. I would say my call to action to everyone on this call and the organizations you work for, in addition to everything that was said, is to assess your business practices and your rewards and your training through the lens of integrity, because there is much to be done. But I think one of the things that really needs to be included in this conversation is doing the right thing. And so often that is not what we see, not just from industry, but from governments and nonprofits too. So let's do the right thing just a little bit more often. Mathieu, it is over to you. Mathieu Lebreche from the Canadian Bankers Association to wrap things up. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope the roughly 400 people registered today enjoyed the discussion. My name is Mathieu Lebreche, Director of Media Strategy at the CBA. On behalf of the CBA, our member banks, and the millions of customers they serve every day, thank you to the panelists for an insightful and indeed very timely conversation. The pandemic put the concept of financial wellness sharply into focus, I think, for a lot of Canadians and for the organizations that support them, including financial institutions. Canada's banks have been there for decades and deeply focused on helping Canadians strengthen their financial knowledge, their skills, and their confidence. And the objective ultimately is to build a stronger foundation for achieving financial goals, acquiring the resilience to deal with setbacks, as we've seen the last 18 months, and ultimately to reach a state of financial well-being. So as we've heard today, digital interventions and other modern tactics will be key to improving financial health in these challenging times and in the increasingly digitalized environment. So again, thank you to the panelists for your thoughtful contributions today. Thank you to the Canadian Club of Toronto for hosting today's event. And I'll now throw it back to Shazan Chu for her closing remarks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mathieu. And thank you again to all our panelists for joining us today. Guests, thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. I'd like to extend another round of thank yous to the Canadian Bankers Association, Home Equity Bank, and LifeWorks for sponsoring today's event. Our events would not be possible without our sponsors, so thank you for your continued generosity. Thank you to our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications and LiveMeeting.ca for making it possible for us to come together virtually today. Guests, we hope you'll join us for some of our upcoming events. On Wednesday, November 17th, we'll meet in person for breakfast when we host the Honourable Peter Bethlen-Falvey, Ontario's Minister of Finance. To learn more about our upcoming events, explore our newly designed website at canadianclub.org. Browse our rich archive and past events, and check out our new updated membership categories with enhanced benefits of various levels. Please consider becoming a member to support our club's network. Guests, thank you for joining us. Please stay healthy and safe.